This is Ashley Newby, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, cultural workers, political organizers, and everyone in between in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have Dr. Aisha Durham, who is a Black feminist cultural critic. Her research explores the relationship between media representations in everyday life using autoethnography, performance writing, and hip hop feminist media studies, which she engages in with international talks in Japan, Germany, and Brazil in her 3 books, including her NCA award winning monograph, Home with Hip Hop Feminism, Performances in Communication and Culture. Dr. Durham is a professor of media, culture, and communication at the University of South Florida. She is a former faculty fellow for Fulbright Hayes, Brazil, an advisory board member for the Hip Hop Anthology for the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and a recipient of the Marsha Houston Award and the Ellis Bochner Autoethnography and Personal Narrative Research Award. Dr. Durham's latest research is featured in Communication, Culture, and Critique, the Community Literacy Journal, and the Handbook of Autoethnography. To democratize knowledge, Dr. Durham produces public scholarship and provides cultural analysis for news and entertainment outlets such as Tampa Bay Times, NPR, CNN, The Times of London, and Miss Magazine. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Durham. How are you?
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
So, to get started, how did you get into Black studies as a field?
I can say I did not know about Black studies as a field per se, but I did know that I was interested very early in all things Black. I started writing little poems before I thought that, you could do this thing called poetry. But before then, even the writing of the poems led me to start my early part of my career in journalism. In fact, I started writing about the lived experience of Black working class, or what we were called at the time underclass communities. I grew up in public housing, and my first news article as a high school student was about a friend of mine who got a college scholarship because she played an instrument that would basically allow her to leave her public housing community to go off to college. I thought that that was an important story, but I also did not know then that I was beginning to do the documentation later on that we would call ethnography. I was doing that documentation then as a high school student and college student of trying to archive the experiences of people that we would define as part of the hip hop generation. So my kind of entree into Black studies as a field was when I was a journalism student in college, and my minor area was in AFAM. I had minor areas in African American studies and gender and women's studies. And as you can see from my work today, I'm still doing those intersections in terms of talking about gender and sexuality, as well as Africana or Black studies. And all of that to say, when I am talking about Black studies, I really want to look at the intersections of lived experience, media or cultural representations, and everyday life. In terms of Black people, particularly in terms of Black working class people. So when I started taking classes in Black studies, I was like, this is what I want to do. There's no media studies without Black studies. And so that became the anchor for my future work, which would be in terms of cultural representations, or what we would call Black popular culture.
So you said several things there that I think are so interesting. One, talking about you were engaging in ethnographic research before you knew what that was, right? Which I really think speaks to the ways in which Black studies does these things. And it's not necessarily formalized with a particular title or acknowledged as what it is, but you were interested in the lives of the people around you and the trajectories of those lives in varying ways and what that meant at a particular moment in time, um, in a way that, as I told you before, the we started like led to this book that I use in all of my classes. But um, how do you situate yourself with? You said there's no media studies without Black studies, right?
Yeah, absolutely. When I think about the kind of work that I was invested in as a journalist and then as a media studies scholar, the idea of representation was not just I'm seeing the stereotype on television. It was connected to projects of freedom. So if you wanted to look at Black freedom movements, whether we're talking about abolition, suffrage, civil rights movement, and even in terms of the hip hop movement or the movement for Black lives, all of those center around representation. And when I'm talking about representation, I'm not just talking about kind of stereotypes, but what Patricia Collins would call controlling images. How are these images used to justify exploitation or to maintain a kind of system of power? So for me, to think about representation and to think about the contributions of Black scholars to talk about representation who were not necessarily in communication meant for me that this was a political project. It was a political project when I was writing those articles about choosing what stories to write, who to foreground, and how to, in some ways, challenge existing representations of the so-called welfare queen or the at-risk teen who is supposedly a representation of me in the hood. So early on, I knew that that was a kind of political project. And I think Black studies helps to ground and anchor and actually grow these other disciplines that, we're not necessarily given props for. You cannot have a gender and women's studies without Black studies because intersectionality basically anchors all forms of gender and sexuality studies today. You can't have a communication a program without thinking about the ways in which Black people, just social media in and of itself, and Black scholars like Andre Brock, Sophia Noble, Maya Bailey, and Sarah Jackson can point to this. Just the call and response that hinges on African American communication. Just the ways in which we have shorthand ways of talking about and conversing with each other, rooted within Black linguistic and communication. So all of these different disciplines that have that are in some ways almost taken for granted. And at different political moments, Black studies can be pushed aside. Black studies is actually the anchor by which many of these disciplines hinge on. And for my discipline in terms of media and communication, absolutely, that is the case.
And thinking about your discipline in media and communication, right? How do you feel that the discipline itself and the ways in which the discipline has developed and maybe some of the things that have to be learned or the training within it, how do you feel like that has impacted your work um, in Black studies or alongside your work with Black studies?
Yeah, so I think if we can go back methodologically, methodologically, uh, one of the ways that I was really invested in um, thinking about how do I speak not only to the theoretical or the conceptual work that I was doing in terms of media and culture, but what are the representational forms that would actually speak to broader kind of Black culture, and that was performance for me. So performance in autoethnography or biomythography, those were forms that I wanted to actually represent. Now, I do also do traditional or conventional media studies or film analysis, but I also know the kind of work that could have movement outside of the academy. And if we think about some of the most prolific and impactful Black cultural studies scholars, also understand their work as kind of public work, public intellectual work. And so performance for me gave kind of entry point, not only to pay homage to those poets and performers who inspire me, but also to think about that as a form in and of itself. Poetry for me, similar to hip hop, as a kind of poetry, was a democratizing form of knowledge. So you didn't have to know all of the fancy words of the academy. There was a way in which you could still talk about experience. You could still talk about those concepts using different kinds of creative intellectual forms. And I know when I use performance, even in reciting it to family members or friends, they're like, I don't know what that means, but I feel that. And that for me is a kind of way in which we're able to have our work have impact and translate outside of what could be a very exclusive space. So, Black studies allowed me to have to think about a multiplicity of perspectives, but also the multiple representational forms in which we convey or communicate knowledge. And that for me was poetry, performance, as well as autoethnography.
So building on that and thinking about the poetry, the performance, and the autoethnography, um, one I want to start with the performance piece. One of the things that I think is one of the things that have come up in some of the other like interviews and just in conversations about Black studies and where we're at with Black studies now is really maybe a stronger connection to community in the past than is like formalized or acknowledged today in the future, right? Like Black studies in the academy is not necessarily um, connected to community broadly in the same ways that it was when it started. What and performance is, like you said, like while you may not everyone may not understand like all of the words that are being used in the classroom, they can connect to that performance and understand what the performance is conveying and feel it. How do you think that can be expanded or used to help increase or return to that connection?
Well, we know Black studies as a field and later a discipline is born out of social movement, right? It's born out of political struggles. So with that, from its inception, it was always already political. But like anything, I mean, we could say this of any formation, even as hip hop is a technology of resistance. It is incorporated. It is assimilated and it looks different. So hip hop culture and some aspect of hip hop culture that we see um, uh, operating in communities writ large, as opposed to hip hop culture that we may see in a commercial aspect, they look different. They have different audiences, different appeals. But it's a different thing. And I think there's room to acknowledge that both of those things can exist with Black studies. So when we're talking about Black studies within the academy, it is useful. It is useful, even if it may not translate or have movement outside of the academy. I won't say that it's not useful at all, because I was one of those students in that classroom who saw I was able to see myself. It was one of the few times when I was able to connect my experience to what's something that I read or anything that would center me. And this is me in undergrad and grad school going to Virginia Commonwealth University. I mean, this is a capital in Richmond, where basically it was like a capital of the Confederacy, but we had no discussion about Blackness at all. In fact, when I was in undergrad, they used to celebrate Lee Jackson Day and MLK Day on the same day, and would tell you, I am celebrating Lee Jackson, so a Confederate general. So this is the experience. And then when I went to University of Georgia, it was the same, much of the same. So that is useful, but I think it's also imperative on us to actually remember and keep alive that connection with community, because the same kind of um, um, I guess the same kind of energy, for lack of a better word, that helped to shape and form Black studies then in the past is the same thing that can help to galvanize and mobilize Black studies today. And I think we have seen some of that, within the past decade or so, in terms of the movement for Black life. That
Mhm.
actually, in some ways, put Black studies as a field and a discipline to task. Like, how will we respond to what is happening literally in the streets? So though I think both, is not a either or, we need to go back, but I think we need to have both of those in conversation with one another, because both of them are necessary.
Thank you. I think that that's the both and conversation is definitely important and should be kept at the forefront as we move into who knows what after tomorrow.
Hey, I'm in Florida right now, so I can give you a glimpse of what is happening. What is happening is that uh, Black studies is being gutted.
Yeah.
It's being gutted, and even if the physical department is there, or people are there, Black studies courses, which are largely part of Gen Ed courses, are being removed from the curriculum. So if these courses are removed from the curriculum, or they're only seen as the electives after you take core classes, then in some ways, you know, um, Black studies is seen as, extra, not necessary, or even, prohibited or eliminated. So this is what's happening in Florida, and this is a precursor for a larger kind of national conversation on the exclusion of perspectives that challenge, existing power, like white supremacy.
Yeah. That's yeah. I think that it is very telling the things that are happening in Florida and Oklahoma and Arkansas and some of the other states where these things have been able to be passed first. Just first, because it's not like these things are not in the works other places. And what that means for the kind of work that is both able to be done institutionally, but also needed to be done outside of the institution in order to ensure that knowledge and history is not just removed, that is sustained in alternative ways if necessary. Um, yeah, it's
But we've always had to do that.
Mhm.
We've always had to do that before there's a program or department or institute. We've always, and I'm saying we as those who are committed to Black studies, whether it's in terms of having informal reading groups, whether
Mhm.
it's in terms of working with a collective of students, whether it's in terms of forming one's own collective. There are always ways in which Black folk in general and Black studies have been adaptable and flexible, but also strategic in the ways in which we are developing and sustaining Black studies. So, you know, a building, yes, that would be wonderful. Formal courses, yes, that will be wonderful. But even before I was at University of South Florida, I was at Texas A&M. And I had formerly cross-listed courses in media and my joint appointment with Africana Studies. Even if that were not the case, what we will learn in this class will still incorporate or integrate or even center Blackness. So that, and if we have questions, then we should question. Why do we even have questions about that? Because whiteness becomes a default and we have no questions. That suggests to us that there could be a problem there. So this time is very critical. I don't want to, undersell or tell us that, we don't have anything to worry about, because those who are working to erase Black cultural studies and Black studies, they're serious in terms of eradicating this contested a form of knowledge that challenges, again, these existing power structures. But we've been here, we will be here. And for that reason alone, that gives me hope in terms of it might not look like the Black studies that we've seen right now, but we are already, as Afrofuturists thinkers, we're always imagining new ways of being and belonging.
That's a wonderful reminder. And thank you. I think that sometimes if you stop and look at just this moment right now, right here, it can be overwhelming. But remembering what has come before and understanding what is possible in the future is an important reminder for being in the work in a way that you have that hope. You know that this is like you said, it might look different, but it's still going to be there.
I want to believe, and I hold this wholeheartedly, that Black folk are future-oriented folk. Even as we are rooted and connected to the past, we have to imagine new ways of being and belonging, because this right here is not how it's supposed to be. So with that, whether we're talking about communication or cultural formations, we have always been future-oriented. It is it's political work for us to think about what, if this is not working, we have to imagine what could work. And for that reason alone, like I said, I'm hopeful that it might look different, but trust it will be there. As long as there remains white supremacists, hetero patriarchy, capitalism, and imperialism, there will be Black studies to contest those dominant structures.
Thank you. That is facts.
Yes.
So that also made me think about, and I mentioned this before we started recording too, right? But in your Home with Hip Hop Feminism book, the method that you lay out, like at the end, but that builds up throughout the book in terms of the recall, the remember, and represent. That is something that I always bring to my students. I think it's super important, but especially like that remember part.
Mm-hmm.
And what you were just saying was making me think about that in the ways in which like memories, it changes, it lives, it shifts. And who you are in this particular moment is going to impact the way that you're looking back at what happened 5, 10, 15 years ago, which is important for us to remember right now. But also in thinking about future iterations of what Black culture, how that's represented, I think is a really useful lens, right? So if you could talk a little bit about that, I would greatly appreciate it. Yeah.
So methodologically, I was a little stumped in terms of trying to think about all the ways I wanted to engage experience, but also representation. Now, I had worked with people who, had, I guess, who would call an anti-humanist or a really text-based way of thinking about representation. This is like spot the stereotype. I'm like, we get it. We got it. It is important. We got it. But representation, or what we might see in media, it is still filtered through our experience. So that idea of remembering, uh, in some ways functions as a point of kind of recalling the past, but also, how am I related? How is my experience related to the image that I am making interpretations? So for me, just a kind of formal or conventional textual analysis was not enough. But even in terms of thinking about ethnography, ways in which, even when we would talk about within group ethnography, where I'm saying that I'm like you, but I'm still supposed to stand outside of myself and talk about a group that I'm saying that I belong. Again, remembering there means to kind of situate yourself as part of the community, to speak with and to speak in communion with others. So that was another way in which I wanted to kind of disrupt even conventional forms of ethnography. And both of them, even in the most exquisite renderings, still had this idea that somehow I'm supposed to write in a way that, it's supposed to appeal to people who didn't look like me. I mean, I remember even in the drafting of the book, I was asked to put footnotes everywhere. I'm like, am I explaining this just to white people? If you didn't get it, it's okay. It was not for you. You can still participate. You can still consume, but maybe you just don't know all of the insider information, and that's okay. But when I set out to kind of talk about one thing in terms of representation, how I experience, see myself, which is the autoethnographic part, in relation to media images about me or bodies like mine, that was a kind of me in relation to myself. Then, when I wanted to do the textual analysis, it was me in relation to kind of popular images. I mean, I mentioned that I've done ethnographies and studies across the country, even in speaking to people who may not necessarily know English, or English as their second language. They knew how to talk about my body, though. They knew how to even give me hand waving to mention, particular aspect of my body. So there was something that was communicated about my Black woman's body that even, that crossed borders. So I wanted to think about, how do we then understand this particular hip hop body? And I did that through representation. And the latter part is ethnography. I wanted to go back home. I wanted to go back home to the public housing community, because there's an aspect of Black studies when we're still grappling with issues of authenticity. We're still grappling with issues of, the people. And that still, in some ways, is embedded in working class, even though we have a market different class. And while I was still economically precarious in grad school, when I did that ethnography, I went away to college. So I had some middle class capital that literally kind of barred me out of the space that the only place that I could call home. So I wanted to know, what was it like for me to now have this formal term, hip hop feminism. Shout out to Joe Morgan, who in a Black feminist class, I got to read this book, and it opened up my mind to the possibility of being situated within women's studies and Black studies. But I wanted to see, what do they think? Because we talking about these working class Black women of the hip hop generation, and they were just like, feminism? You mean feminine? Feminism, you mean, so let me tell you about my day. And I was like, that term is a term that was operated within college courses, which was okay. But in some popular courses, but the everyday women who were living in that public housing community, they were like, I gotta deal with, taking care of my kids. I gotta do this. I have this job. I got this. And so that made me think about, okay, that makes us hip hop feminism is here. But if we're talking about live culture, we're still talking about these very things that are associated with working class Black womanhood. And maybe we need to have both of these conversations together in terms of experience, representation, and still thinking about the broader kind of implication of Black feminism at that time. So having these different kind of methods allowed me to have a more nuanced way of thinking about hip hop, but it also allowed me to pay homage to the people who did that work before me, using poetry, using performance, using autoethnography. And so I just think the beauty of the work that's coming in Black cultural studies, they also do that kind of multimodal or representation in terms of creative intellectual work. I love it.
Thank you.
And I want to say this is another example of that kind of representational work.
Thank you. As I shared, like I think that that's the positioning of self in that book was so impactful to me, and thinking about the ways that but I literally cannot divorce myself from this work. Like, for me to pretend that I don't have a perspective that is going to be embedded in what I'm doing is false.
It
And
is.
and that adds to the inauthenticity of what's happening.
But that idea of objectivity, that idea of the omniscient researcher is connected to whiteness.
Mhm.
So when we're thinking about Blackness, there's a way in which Blackness, and I don't necessarily mean Black people, I mean Blackness as a construct, Blackness as a way in which challenges those existing kind of cultural narratives or even research positions. We're supposed to be looked at. So to possess the gaze and to say, I am here and I am the one watching. I am also in community with other people who look like me. That disrupts our conventional ways of not only thinking about the ethnographer or the anthropologist, but also in terms of thinking about the cultural critic. Like, I am a part of the culture by which I am offering my critique. That challenges these existing positions, and so I think that is a beauty, especially when you see the writing. I know that you all have also interviewed people like Mark Anthony Neal. I read Mark Anthony Neal and I wanted to put my books down and say, this is it. This is the kind of writing and this is a kind of discussion in terms of Black culture that we've experienced with existing kind of academic scholarship that feels that feels like he is drawing from that kind of wealth or the richness of Black culture. And I mean, I would hope I am also modeling myself after work such as his.
Thank you. I really personally appreciated that. And I definitely think that, the work that you do and that honesty and that challenge that, like, we all are more honest with the work that we do is so important and so necessary. That subjectivity, the objectivity, the myth of objectivity. Because even, when we're talking about traditionally and like Blackness being this thing that's watched from the outside,
Mm-hmm.
white researchers are not objective either.
Of
And
course they're not.
that like you can talk about this from an objective perspective because you're not a part of no, who you are and the experiences that you've had, the stereotypes you've been exposed to, the things that you've internalized are all impacting the way that you're conducting your study as well.
Absolutely. 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 And what I want to do is to make that plain. To make that plain.
I think you did that. Thank you.
But also and when you're saying talk about those fairs, also I mean, I also talk about my struggle. I mean, people can look at my work early on. I was not feeling Beyonce. I am a post Lemonade Beyonce fan, but not before. And there was a lot of stuff, a lot of things said. But I have to say, one of the ways in which, again, I couldn't divorce that from my own class background, and I was like, if I or if girls who look like me or women who look like me perform the kind of, I guess we would call in the language of ratchet today, perform that, but that had that class background, we would be having different words associated and different ways of seeing these girls and women. So there was a way in which she was allowed to be able to be both kind of pop princess, but also being kind of ratchet because of her own class standing. And this has everything to do with her economic background, with her with colorism or the color caste system that's operating still within Black communities. And I wanted to kind of wrestle with that. Even with hip hop feminism, I wanted to wrestle with, the same way as a media studies scholar. How are we liking this song and we just know what is happening here? I wanted to think about in the same way that we can go to the movies and we might like CGI or we might like genre, but we don't know, or we might like the actor or actress in the film, but everything else could be trash. So I wanted to also provide that kind of ways in which culture is messy. And I
Mhm.
think one of the things, if we are having that kind of honest, kind of introspective or reflexive way of engaging with culture, then we also come up with, different ways to flesh our analysis. And I think by having that, your politics out there, by saying, this is my relationship to this text or this culture, I think that's a way of saying, hey, I'm telling you the messiness of everyday life, and this is a part of culture. And I think in some ways, my work in terms of hip hop feminism works to talk about that kind of messiness.
The cultural messiness, like, I think that is very poignant and important. It's like, yes,
That's
cultural
life. It is life.
contradictions. Yes, it is life. And I think that's, I mean, as you said before, like Joan Morgan's book, I needed a feminism that was
Hmm.
able to look at these gray areas and
Yep.
say, like, this is not straightforward. There's not a black and white yes or no answer.
Yep.
There's not a stance that I have to stand 100% on this side or else I can't be a like that's
Yeah.
not how life works.
Yes. Absolutely.
So, what do you think, or how do you think the work that you do and like all of the methodological methodological insights that you have, how do you feel like that informs your teaching and what you do in the classroom?
One of the ways that I think that the different methodological forms inform my classroom is that I'm open. I'm open to learning new ways and representational forms, but I'm also, open to experimentation because I think that, if I am only wedded to this one way of looking at the world, then I am missing all these other kind of formations that are taking place. So, I mean, I know with people that I have worked with and I've advised, for example, one of recent graduates has been, talking about hip hop performance and masculinity. And uses performance as a previous slam poet to do so. Have another previous student, all now, great professors now, who uses animation and was thinking about animation as a way of not only kind of illustrating experience, but saying how stop motion in and of itself talks about what she calls the arresting moments that she has in terms of engaging with white supremacy and misogynoir. So those, all of them, and mainly many of the people that I work with, use autoethnography, media, and some other form as a way to say these are the different ways in which I'm experiencing it. And there's no one method that's going to be able to, in some ways, capture that topic or what I'm describing as lived experience. So I think that that is the beauty. And many of the new scholars in Black studies, in particular Black cultural studies, whether it's Aria Holiday, Ashley Wade, those folks are also using multiple methods as a way to tackle one. So I think this is the beauty of Black studies, not just my work, but seeing how mine was rejected, I have to tell you, early on. Even the publisher, and which is why I went with Peter Lang. But other publishers were like, girl, you're doing too much. Do you want an audience study? Do you just want it to be performance? Do you just want it to be auto? It's like so much. But now we almost take it for granted that we have this multi-perspectival or multimodal way of looking at it. But this was not unlike other work that I see, that I reviewed, that I wanted to be in conversation with. So the future in terms of these new scholars, including scholars like yourself, use the personal, use communal, or even thinking about having conversations among themselves and saying, hey, what do we have from this? What are we theorizing here? And let that stand as research, I think is beautiful today. And to think about the different kinds of forms. Again, podcasts being one of them, animation being one, poetry being another, or even creating music itself as a form in terms of research work. So all of these creative intellectual approaches to Black cultural studies and Black studies research, I think this is, I don't know, I feel like it is a kind of broader terrain in which we are more accepting of these different forms.
I think that's such an important point. And one of the things that has come up before on a couple of the episodes is that, like, you Black studies is about the questions, and taking the methods that you need from the disciplines and the fields that you need to answer the question. Like, what question am I asking, and what is going to help me
Yeah.
to reach an answer?
Yeah, not being wedded or anchored or chained to any one area, whether it's in terms of method or representational form. Because we could do a lot of methods and it can end up being long prose that nobody else is going to entertain. Or we can do ones that we know will be dynamic, meaning we know will have movement, whether it's outside of our discipline, whether it's outside of the academy, writ large. So those are also questions. So it's the question in terms of the broader research question. It is about form, but also, so what? So how might this impact serve the broader kind of Black community?
I think that's a wonderful place to transition into what are you most excited about in terms of, like, where the field is going in the future of Black studies, particularly in this moment where there's a lot of pushback against current iterations of it.
Yeah, I think what for me seems to be most hopeful is how Black scholars, whether you got the letters behind your name or public intellectuals, how Black scholars are using digital, new media, social media in order to create and carve new spaces of Black intellectual production. That for me is exciting because we might think that Black studies is in, and I'm using my hands to have this world in terms of the academy here, and then it reverberates outside. But I think social and digital media is actually crafting the conversations that will impact and influence what is happening inside of the academy. So that creative intellectual space online and in digital media, I think for me, that is most promising. And for me, that is most engaging. And I think that space is the where we should look at in terms of kind of new political and cultural formations.
Thank you. I think that's an interesting and like, yeah, what's happening outside of the academy is very much impacting and affecting what we are doing inside
For
of it.
good or for good or for worse, for better or for worse, but hopefully for better in terms of Black studies, especially with Black scholars.
Thank you so much for your time and your generosity and your responses. Is there anything you would like to add to end, or is there a current project you would like to talk about?
I think most of my work that I'm doing, whether I am talking about media representations, and right now I am focused on ideas about stuff, stuff in terms of I'm thinking about belonging. Belonging becomes this kind of catch-all term to talk about community inclusiveness,
Yeah.
but I want to talk about belongings, to think about what are the kind of what how do we think about Black materiality, and how does that shape and inform our identity? So I'm doing that through a series of different talks that I've had, or I presented about things that are associated with me growing up, dragging the stuff from state to state to state, and how these things shape my understanding of Blackness. But in general, I think that we are in good hands. I feel very old school. I feel very old school these days in the classroom. I thought I was, young, and I was like, yes, I know all of this, all the things. Now it's like, no, Dr. Durham, this is like 20 years old. But I'm like, but it's still relevant. But I want to say, in terms of, we cannot think about popular culture in general without thinking about Black popular culture. Black popular culture sustains and basically um, anchors all of what we're talking about in terms of modern culture. So if we want to know anything about contemporary media and culture, then we have to turn to Black studies. And for that, whether there's a actual building or classroom, with that, I think that we're always going to be central and integral to the maintenance of any form of cultural studies.
Thank you so, so, so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too. You too. Thank you.